Our lesson for this week is going to be on scatter plots. It'll be on Study Island, and I'm just going to get right into it. I think what I want to do here is just go through the lesson on Study Island, kind of narrate through some things, point out some tips and tricks to go along the way, and then show you a couple of the examples. So what we're talking about here are scatter plots. And scatter plots are a visual way to show a relationship between two sets of data. And we usually like to plot them on a coordinate plane. So what we're going to look at here is Sabrina. She's planning a surprise birthday party for her sister. She collected information for the cost of different venues and different numbers of guests at the party. So this table shows the information that she collected. And she plotted this to kind of look at, like, how does the cost of the party relate to the number of guests? So the most important thing to recognize here is what the axes are telling us. So you'll notice the horizontal axis is the number of guests, and then the cost of the party is the vertical axis. So when we're plotting 465, 14,170, 692, and so on and so forth, the different points in this table right here, we have to pay attention to the labels on the axes. So another thing we have to pay attention to are the intervals on each of the axes. So notice it's definitely not going by ones. If we're looking at the vertical axes, these are all the same here. It's going by 20s, because you'll see 40 is on the second line. So if I take 40 divided by 2, that means everything's going by 20s. So after that 40, that's 60, and then 80, and then 100, then 120, 140, and so on and so forth. The horizontal line is going by 2s because the second line is 4, which means every line is by 2. So it's going 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and so on and so forth. So when we're looking at this first point, let me go ahead and erase all this stuff in here so it doesn't get in the way. So we're looking at the first point. We are looking at 465. And this question is asking which scatter plot matches up with the data in the table. So 465, the number of guests, we go on the horizontal axis over to 4, and then we have to go up to 65. So both of these look like they have that point. And there are actually 4 different options in this particular, excuse me. There's actually 4 different options in this particular one. So we have 465, which it appears that W, X, Y, and Z all have 465. It looks like they have the same next one. So we're going to try to look for where are they different. All right, and it looks like they're kind of different, kind of in the middle and the end. So let me go ahead and pull back that marker back up here. So maybe around the end is when they're going to start getting a little different. So let's go ahead and let's look at 2190. So we go over to where the 20 is, and we want to go up to where 190 is. So we're going right along this line here, and we're trying to figure out where would 190 be. 190 would be just under the 200, and there are no dots in that area. So definitely not W. We go over to where 20 is on X, and we go up to 190. That looks like it's right there. So it could be X. If we go and look at the other options, 2190, if I look at 20 on W, it's going up to over 200, so it's not Y, but 2190 is also on Z. So we're looking at something between X and Z here. So let's see if we can get it so we can see the table and the points here for X and Z. So we know not W, not Y, between X and Z. And I'm looking at the next one. So let's look at 21 to 30. So 21 is going to be halfway here. and that's definitely not at 230. That's right at 200. So it looks like it's going to be Z, and if we look at this point here, that is definitely going to be at 230 because we're going by 20s, remember. So the one that matches up with the table is Z. 465 is on there, 14,170, 692, all of those points match up. So a big thing with scatter plots that you have to know how to do is plot points on the coordinate plane. So remember, the horizontal axis goes left and right, and the vertical axis goes up and down. And typically, we call this the independent variable. The independent variable, the number of guests is kind of independent, but what depends on the number of guests is the cost of the party. And that's what we put on the vertical axis. You won't have to be responsible for that, but you'll have to be responsible for looking at the labels and knowing what data points go along with that. The next thing we're going to look at with scatter plots are some patterns that occur. Once again, scatter plots show how things are related. There's no labels on these, they're just talking about the different things we can see. So clusters, if you think about a cluster, it means kind of like a group of something that's all clumped together in one spot, which is why you see this cluster is just kind of a whole bunch of points in the same general area. So they say a cluster is data that are grouped closely together. So right in the middle of kind of 6 and 7 on the horizontal axis, you go up and you see that cluster. Outliers are things that are kind of different from everything else. So in general, I'm going to go ahead and bring up this marker again. In general, you see most of this data is on this line right here. All right, and some things, they're not right on that line, but they're pretty close to it, except for this guy down here. And sometimes you have more than one outlier. But outliers are things that are just kind of, they're different, they're way off from where everything else is. And that happens. You always say like, oh, there's an exception to everything. That's kind of what an outlier is. An outlier is an exception. The next thing that they talk about is correlation. And correlation is a very important concept. Correlation basically talks about how things are related to each other. And you notice the word relation is right in the word correlation. And when you have to determine is it positive or negative, that's kind of looking at the slope of it. So if you look at this first set, from left to right, that line is kind of going up. So the trend, as the x increases, the y increases, and that's what you see in the description here. Both sets of data are increasing, and that's a positive correlation. But when both sets of data don't do the same thing, so in this case, the x is increasing because it's going from left to right, but the y is decreasing, that is a negative correlation. All right, and if you kind of drew a line down the middle of it, that's not quite down the middle of it, but just let's pretend that it was. I'm going to redraw that actually. That's a little better. So if you draw, and this kind of called a line of best fit to get the trend, that line's going in the downward direction, so kind of like slope from left to right. As slope is going down, we call it negative. And what that means is as x is increasing from left to right, the y's are decreasing. So that's a negative correlation. And those both, you notice how I drew lines there, because those are both linear relationships. But there are some scatter plots that don't make lines. All right, so this first one, that's an example of a linear relationship. It doesn't have to be a perfect line, but just kind of has to fit in the shape of a line. But sometimes they don't always do that. For this example, it's clearly not a line. Now, a little bit of it might be looking like a slight line. If I look at, this part here or that part there, those are definitely linear types of relationships, but not together. All right, and you can't say something is linear and nonlinear at the same time. So it's either one or the other. Study Island tries to trick you a little bit in saying, oh, this is a linear and nonlinear situation. It can't be. It's got to be one or the other here. So this one, if you try to draw a model that fit it, would kind of look like that. And that is clearly not a line. So this would be a non-linear relationship. Some other things that they're looking at is kind of how do we interpret this? And this goes right back to the correlation. How are these things related to each other? And if we kind of drew a line between these things, like we did a couple times, we get something like this, which shows us that as the hours of studying increase, so do the test scores. They also increase. So that's a positive correlation there. All right, and that's what we basically have to look at is both are increasing in this situation. The rest is just kind of like Khan Academy videos that we've already talked about. I'm going to go ahead and let's get right into some of the problems that you're going to be looking at here. All right, so this is very similar to the very first example, just what scatter plot matches the data from the table. And we're looking for things that are a little different. I'm gonna go right on the table and look at the different points. So 120, the class periods are on the horizontal axis. So when we say 1, we're going to the right one. And the number of students is on the vertical axis, so we'll be going up for that. So 120 means we go to the right one and up 20. So we've got that point there, we've got it there, we've got it there, and we've got it there. So that one didn't help us at all. If we look at 215, the next one, so we go over 2 up to 15, it should be right about there, but it's not on W. It looks like it's there on X. All right, right there. I don't see it on Y, and I do see it on Z, so that's a possibility here. So I'm just going to look at the comparisons. These two are in the same spot, so I'm not going to worry about those. These look to be in the same spot, so I'm not going to worry about those. So it's the last 2 points that I'm going to see where is the discrepancy here. So I'm going to go to 5, 15. I go over to 5. This 15, or that's not 15, that's between 16 and 20, so it's not X. And this 5, that's under the 16, between 12 and 16, so that one works. And just to double check, 625 is also up there. So we're looking at Z for this particular answer. Let's go ahead and answer Z. Go on to the next question. So this scatter plot shows the number of hours each student in Mrs. Schwartz's class studied history last week and the score they received on the test. All right, so they say plot a point over every outlier in the scatter plot. So if we're looking at kind of a line of best fit here and the trend between these two, we're looking at kind of this kind of line. And all of these points fit that general trend. And that general trend is the higher the test grade means they studied more hours. Now, once again, there are exceptions. There are people that study a lot but maybe don't know the best ways to study, or they study a lot, maybe they studied the wrong information. And that's what this guy was. This guy studied a lot, studied 9 hours, but didn't do as well as most other people. All right, now still scored an 86, which isn't terrible. And then there was this guy down here. This is a guy that most people don't like in class, a guy that doesn't have to put any work into it and still gets a good score. So he only studied for an hour and still got an 88%. So those are the exceptions. Like we mentioned earlier, there's exceptions to every rule. That's what outliers are. So these are the 2 outliers. So what they're asking us to do is to plot a point where those outliers are. So I'm going to use my point tool. I'm going to put a point over that one and a point over that one. Next was, this is just asking for the trend. So as the average age increases, the TV per night decreases, which kind of makes a lot of sense. As you get older, you have to devote your time to a lot of other things, not just recreational stuff. So the older a person gets, the less television he or she watches. Definitely makes sense for A. Got another question here with a scatter plot. So throughout the day, people who got off the ride and purchased lemonade were asked how long they had to wait in line for the roller coaster. And we've got these results here. Now, if I tried to draw a line to show a general trend here, I'm not really seeing one here. Things don't seem to be going up. Things don't seem to be going down. So I'm not really seeing much of a correlation here. So let's go ahead and take a look at the options and see which one kind of matches that. And here it is right here, B. There is no relationship between the wait time and the number of cups sold. And that's a possibility when you're dealing with scatter plot. Not everything is related to other things. Like you could, just an easy example, you can talk about your hair length compared to your grade in math class. All right, your hair length has absolutely nothing to do with your grade in math class, so you would likely see a scatter plot like this. So scatter plots are useful to seeing if there is a relationship, and then if there is a relationship, what kind of relationship. Sometimes there isn't one, and that's what we have in this situation. This one here. All right, I can totally see a relationship with this one. We've got a linear relationship, kind of like that. And we do have an outlier. All right, we've got a couple different things here. W is an outlier. At X, we kind of see a little cluster there. And Y and Z, they go right along with the trend. Now, this particular question is asking, what would you say W is? And we just mentioned W is definitely an outlier compared to all of the other information that we have. So we're going to select outlier and move on to the next question. This one, we've got I can see a positive correlation because as the X is going up, so is the Y. It doesn't go into this, but I'm also going to say that this is also linear. All right, and usually when we're talking about positive or negative, we're talking about linear. Now, it is totally impossible to have a positive and negative correlation. That is something that cannot happen. But this one is a positive correlation, so we're going to go ahead and select B. We're on fire here, 6 out of 6. Same thing with this one. Definitely a correlation. It's going up from left to right. So this is a positive correlation. I'm not going to spend too much time on it since it was very similar to the last question. This one also is a positive correlation, but it's asking for something a little different here. So one thing you got to remember about Study Island, if they have the little squares, that means you can select more than one. All right, so we're not just going to select one and just go with that. So we've got the first option. Oh. First option is the point 880 is an outlier. So if I look at 880, I go over to 8 and up to 80. I'm trying to get all of this as much as I can on here so we can determine what's a good answer and what's not a good answer. So 880 is right there. And that seems to be with the trend. All right, so this is kind of the trend right here. All of this stuff is pretty close to that line. So all of that is not going to be an outlier. So it's not going to be 880. 260, however, they only spent 2 hours at the mall and spent $60. That's the outlier. That is definitely an outlier. So we're going to select that one eventually. The scatter plot contains more than 4 outliers. I'm really only seeing 2. The 260 and the 4.5, 15. It's very rare that somebody spends 4.5 hours at the shopping center and only spends $15. There is an outlier at 5.545. That's incorrect. It's actually at 4.540. So this one's at 4.515. 5.545 would be right about here. It's that point. That's not an outlier. That's close enough to the rest of the data for it not to be considered an outlier. The next one, the point 7.585. So 7.5 is right here. 85 is up here. That's consistent with the data, so that's not going to be it. And I can't see that other one, so let me go ahead and get rid of this. So we know the 0.260 is one of them. There's an outlier at 4.515. That's the other one that we identified. That one is correct. So there are 2 answers for this one. Keep in mind, little squares mean you can select more than one. Circles mean it's only one. This one should be fairly simple to see. As we are increasing the weight, the unit price decreases. So that is a negative correlation. And this is another one asking for which scatter plot matches the data. So looking at 1.8, I see 1.8 there, I see 1.8 there, 1.8 there, and 1.8 there, so that doesn't help us. 2.5 would be right about here, so that's not in there. 2.5 would be right about there, so it's not X. I don't see 2.5 on Y, so the only one that has 2.5 is Z. Weird how every single scatter plot question has been Z. And then 3.10 is there. If I look at 4.6, it's there. 5.8 is there, and 6.10 is there. So that just further confirms that our answer is Z. Oh, they switched up the order here. I thought Z would be the last one there. So like I mentioned, your assignment this week is going to be on Study Island, and it's going to be called Scatter Plots. So don't get on to Alex to complete this one. And if you need any help, as always, you can get onto my Zoom sessions during your class time or office hours for any assistance. But this one should be a fairly simple question. I'm expecting a lot of 100%. Good luck.